Welcome to Harvard's Critical Issues. The bad news is, of course, that we're not able to assemble at Harvard as we had before the coronavirus started. The good news is that since we've taken to Zoom, we now have an audience that extends beyond our local audience, and we're happy to welcome those of you from other areas who are able to join us today. Last week is the first time we tried the critical issues with the Zoom, and it worked great because we had a great opening speaker who was Bill Overholt. And Bill Overholt is a friend of Jim Mulvenon, and when I suggested who were some of the speakers we should get this year, he says Jim Mulvenon. And so I will turn it over to Bill Overholt, and he will introduce Jim Mulvenon. And Mark, Nick, do you want to say a word about how you handle questions before we get started?
Sure. Thank you, Ezra. So if you attended last week's session, it's going to be very similar. There is a Q&A tab at the bottom that you should be able to click on and enter your questions. If you have questions throughout the event, feel free to enter them there, or you can save them for the Q&A section at the end. I expect we'll have far more Q&As than we actually have time for. And so I'm just going to go through and I'm going to kind of pick them at random. So apologies if your question is not gotten to. In terms of the question, it's the question function itself. There is the option to make yourself anonymous. If you wish to do so, please use that function. If not, include your name and your affiliation so that we can say who you are and who's asking the question. I will be back at the end to ask those questions for everybody. Bye.
Bill Overholt, it's yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce James Mulvenon. James is Director for Intelligence Integration at SOSi Intelligence Solutions Group. Before that, he was Vice President of Defense Group International's Intelligence Division and Director of their Center for Intelligence Analysis. If you wonder what all that means, James teaches managers of spooks how to manage spooks. He's often ahead of his time. When we were at RAND together in 2002, he taught me about the future problems we were going to have with Huawei. He's the author of the book, Chinese Industrial Espionage, which is the Bible of American research on intellectual property theft. He got his bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan, studied Communist Party history at Fudan University in Shanghai, and got his Ph.D. from UCLA. It's a pleasure to welcome James Mulvenon.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for the kind invitation to speak today. I'm happy to be with all of you. You're right, I work now for a company called SOSi International right here on the Polo. I'd like to give a shout out to the SOSi employees around the world that may be attending today. And also a bit of a preview, we just sent to the publisher the sequel for Chinese Industrial Espionage, which is titled as the same as my talk today, Beyond Espionage, and talks about many of the new phenomena. And now the other interesting thing is normally at this time of year, I would be traveling around the country, going to public policy schools and recruiting. I will tell you that we are hiring for all the students out there. If you speak mission critical languages and you're eligible for a US security clearance, please just DM me on Twitter because we actually hired 3 people in the last 2 weeks. So despite the pandemic, we are actively growing and looking for new people. The main theme of my talk today is continuity and change. Areas where we see continuity in our relationship with China across these very controversial areas, and in areas where we see it changing. And in my homage to Kurt Campbell, I have 3 points that I'd like to make today. The first deals with the phenomena of industrial espionage and IP theft. And despite the pandemic, which obviously has restricted our physical travel, the evolution of Chinese government-sponsored behavior in this area continues apace. Now, what are my metrics for that? I will stipulate from the outset that I'm actually quite skeptical of assessments of monetary damage that people like to throw around. I think they're often self-serving and inflated. I'm much more focused on specific cases, specific damage to industries and specific companies. And I'll talk about some of that today, rather than sort of try to bowl you over with large numbers, billions of dollars here and there. A key indicator for me is always cases worthy of prosecution. And while I'll talk a little bit later about some of the dilemmas we've had, some of the mistakes that have been made in that area, I will tell you from many, many years of dealing with assistant U.S. attorneys all around this country, that they are very conservative about taking cases to court, and generally don't want to go into a courtroom and be embarrassed, and generally have very high thresholds for the evidentiary standard that they use to push these cases. But why is it, frankly, let's get to the heart of the matter. Why is it that we've seen this dramatic increase over the last almost 20 years in Chinese government-sponsored espionage and IP theft? Now, my good Marxist answer to that is the economic factors of production. There was an interesting Chinese economic conference in December 2004. And you have to understand, from 1978 to 2004, we had seen all of the dramatic successes of the Chinese economic modernization. They were on the covers of all the magazines, quadrupled their GDP. But there was something about the materials at this meeting that suggested a malaise. There was a reassessment. And in particular, they were very focused on the fact that what had happened, as dramatic as it was, as successful as it was, had nonetheless been a fairly shallow modernization. What do I mean by that? They were still largely enclaves of places in China that were importing components from abroad, assembling those components into finished products and exporting them, rather than the depth of indigenous production, indigenous innovation within China. And moreover than that, there was a real concern that there were just not enough global Chinese brands. Unless, you're like, you were a wine aficionado and you had a high-R wine fridge, or you're a telecoms company with Huawei equipment. At that point, in 2004, there were really not that many Chinese brands. And so they began to put together the elements of a very large strategic effort, the most important of which were a series of industrial plans. And I want to highlight the 2006 to 2020 mid to long range S&T plan, which highlighted the extent to which they needed to put greater pressure on the multinational companies that were operating in China to more aggressively and more rapidly transfer their technology to promote this indigenous innovation of Chinese companies. But there was also a section of that report that called for a collection by other means, which in other sources we know was a euphemism for increasing espionage and IP theft, because most of the technology that they were really interested in on the high end was simply not resident in China. And the only option at that point they had to get to it was through these illicit efforts. But there were a range of other key elements of this strategic effort. There were the state subsidies. Many of you are familiar, no doubt, with China's efforts to modernize its semiconductor and integrated circuit industry. And they set up the so-called IC fund with $150 billion to go out and buy major companies, major technology around the world. The phenomenon of military-civilian fusion, which used to be known as civil-military integration, which was the dynamic by which defense technologies and civilian technologies could be interchanged within those two systems. And here I have to give a shout out to Harvard's own Elsa Kania, who is doing some really interesting work in that area. And I'm always happy to work with her. You have the national champion phenomena. And here, we can talk about Huawei all day long, but national champions in each industry that get generous state subsidies through bank lines of credit, tax breaks, and other things in order to be portrayed to the outside world as China's global competitor in a given industry. We've seen a blizzard of laws and regulations come out in the last 5 or 6 years, including the cybersecurity law, which dramatically changes the dynamic for information technology modernization and data protection within China. We've seen China use information and communication technology standards at the global level as a trade weapon in order to create openings for Chinese companies and in some cases to distort the international market. We've seen in recent years their use of overseas investment strategies through mergers and acquisitions and joint ventures and greenfield investments that then fundamentally caused the US Congress to update our Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States law to anticipate some of these new moves. You know, although it's a little outre right now, obviously One Belt, One Road as a mechanism, in my view, for creating global path dependency for Chinese companies and Chinese standards around the world. And then finally, cyber and technology espionage to facilitate a number of these dynamics. So I want you to think first and foremost about embedding that espionage within all the contours of that larger strategic effort. Now, some of you may be familiar with a study that Andrew Kim did in the Cardozo Law Review, in which he analyzed quite a few Chinese espionage and IP theft cases in the United States at the behest of the Committee for 100, looking for evidence of racial bias within the Department of Justice prosecutions. I do think that there were significant methodological flaws in Mr. Kim's study, which I lay out at more length in our new book. But and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but I think suffice to say, one of the comments of one of the external reviewers that was actually quoted in the report may be sufficient to sort of summarize my position. He said, Dr. David Harris said, we must recognize the limitations of this data. We cannot tell how many investigations took place during the study period, what ethnic groups the target of those investigations came from, and the rate at which those investigations actually blossomed into charged cases. The data presented in this study do not prove the existence of researching while Asian. So I have to applaud Mr. Kim for putting such a strong critique review within his report itself, but I have to agree with a lot of the findings. Instead, I've done a lot of my own analysis of the cases since 2004, and I'd like to offer that to you. The Department of Justice recently announced that there were over 1,000 investigations currently ongoing around the United States involving IP theft with a China nexus. That either means that there is a contact with some sort of an entity in China, all the way to the point where there's an identified, what we call a foreign instrumentality, which is an entity that is either part of the Chinese government or they're under the direct control of the Chinese government who's involved in the cases. And all 56 of the FBI's field offices are conducting, nationwide, are conducting investigations involving IP theft. Since the early 2000s, 80% of the economic espionage cases in the United States involve some level of Chinese instrumentality. And there's a nexus to China in at least 60% of the trade secret theft cases. Now, in my own research, I've looked at 147 of these cases, either what we call an 1831 case, which is economic espionage under US law, or an 1832, which is trade secret theft. Among those 147 cases, there were 33 indictments that are still pending, and there were 114 convictions. But lest anybody out there think that this is some recent phenomena associated with the current administration or with the trade war, I will tell you that that data reveal very significant spikes in cases in 2009 and 2013 during the Obama administration. I will say that in terms of the cases in the last 2 or 3 years, it's clear that the DOJ's China initiative has in fact devoted additional resources to these cases, and certainly greater encouragement of these cases. One of the interesting findings, though, is that contra Mr. Kim's study, that it's actually national origin, not ethnicity, that is the most dispositive indicator among the data set. That the number of either PRC citizens who were permanent residents in the United States or naturalized US citizens of PRC origin never fell below half in any of the cases. And I would only contrast that with the recent espionage cases involving more traditional government secret stealing espionage, in which the vast majority of the people convicted in the United States, and here I'm talking about Kevin Patrick Mallory, Glenn Duffy Shriver, Fondren and Burgesson, were in fact not Chinese ethnicity at all. And so we see the Chinese intelligence services perhaps trying to go against type, perhaps go against what they believe is a counterintelligence bias within the US system by recruiting Anglos as potential assets rather than recruiting ethnic Chinese. But on the IP theft and economic espionage side, it's overwhelmingly PRC citizens or naturalized US citizens of PRC origin. Interestingly, very few people from Taiwan, despite the linguistic and cultural affinity that they might enjoy in being able to facilitate those kinds of cases. But the other interesting thing that pops out of the data for me is who the beneficiaries are in China across these 147 cases. 57% of them are organizations that I would identify as a foreign instrumentality. Now, that's not just government and military organizations, but given the nature of the Chinese political milieu, I would also include, for instance, universities in that. Why? Because Chinese universities, many of them are either directly subordinate to the State Administration of Science and Technology and Industry for National Defense, like Harbin Engineering University, or are subordinate to the Ministry of Education. But my own experience at Fudan certainly taught me that the party secretary of Fudan University was much more powerful than the president of Fudan University. And so the existence of party committees throughout the university system, the ability of the Ministry of Education, which is itself dominated by its party committee, to appoint major administrators in the university, department chiefs, and so on and so forth. I do not view Chinese universities, therefore, as independent educational institutions, as we're accustomed to in the United States. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence in the cases involving Chinese universities that they worked very closely with the Ministries of Science and Technology and the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology to coordinate collection requirements, to receive funding, to open up labs that were going to exploit the technology that was being acquired from the United States through these collection channels. Now, this is not to say that there haven't been wrongful accusations against individuals of Chinese descent here in the United States. That is certainly true. And I would only make the following distinction, which is, and this may be cold comfort, and there's nothing I can really do about that, but the combination of our free press and our independent judiciary in the United States has meant that many of the people, if not all of them, that were wrongly accused have in fact avenues for relief from those wrongful accusations, and have in fact received monetary awards from the US government for those wrongful accusations. And I can only contrast that with China, which brags of its near 100% conviction rate within its judicial system, and ask whether people in fact would have the same type of relief from wrongful accusation and prosecution on the Chinese side. Just something for you to ponder. My second point today is that the US government, I think rightly, and this was the main theme of our book, Chinese Industrial Espionage, which I co-authored with two colleagues from the US government, that the US government is increasingly focused not on economic espionage and IP theft as a criminal threshold, but increasingly focused on what we call non-traditional collection. And this is collection going on among researchers in labs and universities and defense industrial-based companies in the United States, where people are being co-opted for technology transfer that falls below the criminal threshold of 1831 or 1832, the economic espionage and trade secret theft cases, but is nonetheless injurious to US national security. And one of the non-traditional collection pathways that you've likely heard a lot about at Harvard are the so-called Chinese government talent programs. In particular, the most infamous of them, the 1,000 Talents program. Now, what are these talent programs? Well, these are very robustly robustly funded programs by the Chinese government to attract foreign talent from abroad to either do research for or research in China. In other words, to find a mechanism to get access to the know-how and the innovation and the scientific expertise that is resident outside of China, to bring it back to China in order to improve indigenous innovation in China and its own R&D base. Now, the 1,000 Talents program, which I said is one of the largest and most famous of these, according to the Global Times, one of the Chinese propaganda outlets, has funded 7,000 researchers around the globe since 2008. Now, the 1,000 Talents program is only one of many programs within the Chinese system. In fact, we're doing a lot of research on the over 590 other talent programs, as well as the 100 startup contests and the 500 supporting offices that exist in China in order to attract this kind of talent from abroad. Now, I'll talk more about this in a little while, but what is the importance of these talent programs? In my view, it actually is trying to fill a major gap that has been revealed in the Chinese innovation system by the economic espionage and trade secret theft, which is to say, we see time and time again in these cases where Chinese entities are stealing the first generation of a technology, bringing it back to China, and then the army of, and here we often hear about, China graduating huge numbers of engineers every year, 500,000 engineers. I wouldn't call all of them engineers in the sense that we would say someone from MIT is an engineer. I think many of them are better described as technicians. These technicians have a remarkable track record through the decades of being able to reverse engineer products from abroad. There's a particular talent there. But reverse engineering is not the same as understanding the organic know-how and innovation that's at the heart of these technologies. And time again, we see Chinese entities having to come back and stealing the second generation of the technology rather than being able to learn enough from the first stolen generation to be able to then innovate and create the second generation. The talent programs, in my view, exist in part to bring the people back to China who can provide the missing intangible context, the mortar between the bricks, that the organic zuofa and shangfa in Chinese that is at the heart of these technologies that is not contained in the stolen blueprints. When these individuals come back and they have these 2-week espionage vacations in China, and they go to the Great Wall and they visit the Terracotta Warriors, but they also spend a week with peers from their industry being debriefed on various technologies, that these are the very fora in which many of these key contextual and intangible innovation questions can be asked about some of these stolen technologies. But these talent programs feed into an enormous tech transfer system on the Chinese side. There are over 24 laws that we've identified in China creating this transfer apparatus. It is managed by a professional cadre of hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese government S&T transfer specialists. These talent programs feed into over 300 so-called pioneering parks for overseas Chinese scholars and 500 incubators, 160 innovation centers, 276 national model transfer organizations, even including 90 plus nonprofit organizations located in the United States who are partnered with Chinese Communist Party and Chinese local and national government organizations in order to spot and assess US technical personnel and bring those people into the talent programs so that they can then participate in this tech transfer apparatus. And when you read Chinese material, and I think that I've always been struck, frankly, as a sinologist by the extent to which the Chinese government regards its language as its first layer of crypto, because so much of the material, the thousands of primary source footnotes in our first book on Chinese industrial espionage, were overwhelmingly Chinese government documents that had never been translated. And one of the consistent themes in these documents is with the concept of operating from two bases, GD, the Anga GD. And what they mean by that is, rather than trying to lure scientific and research personnel to China permanently, that they would prefer that those personnel stay in the United States and in Western Europe and other places, because that's where the innovation is occurring. And so while they want them to travel to China at Chinese government expense, they want them to divulge technical knowledge through scripted venues, they want to be briefed, they want to brief these individuals on China's technology interests, they also then want them to return to this foreign base, this foreign GD, so that they can maintain their access to the information. Now, some of you are familiar in the last year or two that both the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation in the United States have begun to crack down on what they regard as inappropriate behavior by scientists and researchers in the United States who have been receiving NIH and NSF grant money. And what they're charging them with, again, to continue this theme, my second theme of non-traditional collection, they are not charging these researchers and scientists with criminal economic espionage or IP theft in almost all cases, but instead charging them with fraud and with lack of disclosure of conflicts of interest, and perhaps most seriously in an academic context, charging people who have been sharing embargoed peer review proposals that have been sent to them as part of the peer review process, and violating their peer review contract by sharing those proposals with colleagues abroad, particularly in China. And we have evidence that then those colleagues in China have been setting up companies and conducting that research and stealing those ideas before they've even been approved in the United States, which is a gross violation of academic rules and academic norms and standards. Now, that being said, NIH has only singled out 61 research institutions in the United States out of the hundreds, if not thousands, of research institutes, and only 16 cases for legal action. I think that the mainstream media would give you the impression that there is a gigantic dragnet against thousands of ethnic Chinese researchers all over the country, and it's simply not borne out by the facts. In fact, NSF recently came out and said that while 6,000 plus ethnic Chinese researchers have received grants over the years, they only can identify 180 or so cases of wrongdoing. And again, this wrongdoing is very much along the lines of fraud, in particular, researchers and scientists who have not disclosed to their home research institution the money that they are receiving from foreign universities, the foreign appointments that they have been receiving. And in the case of NIH and NSF, incorrectly filling out US government paperwork, which to the extent to which they are double dipping and receiving money from two different organizations, one US government, one PRC government for the same research, which is a violation of the contracts that they would have with the US government. Now, I am unable, for a variety of reasons, to comment on the Professor Lieber case. So any of you that have questions about that, I'm going to have to demur on that. But I would say that, you know, the details of that case, while at the high end in terms of the money involved, are very similar to many of the cases we have around the country. And Professor Lieber is not alone in being of non-ethnic Chinese descent, who is nonetheless being investigated for these types of academic violations. Good examples, for instance, Professor Percival Zhang at Virginia Tech, who was a full-time professor there, and yet was also claiming that he had a full-time job at the Tianjin Institute of Industrial Biology. Can't be in two places at once. I'm not a quantum physicist, but clearly trying to charge the same hours to two different institutions. Similarly, Franklin Tao at the University of Kansas, similar charge that he had accepted a position at Fudan University, which was simply violated the laws of physics in terms of being able to be two places at once and to receive two sources of unreported income. And Chunzai Wang from the government National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency, who had also accepted a Chinese position. In all cases, these transgressions had gone on for a long time, and it is fair to say that the US government had not been as perspicacious as it could have in the past, but the rules are the rules. And so I think going forward, there's going to be much greater scrutiny of these kinds of activities involving research collaboration with China. That being said, the sunshine policy of being completely transparent, no one is being persecuted or investigated for their overt relationships with Chinese research organizations, unless those overt relationships have some other reason to be investigated, such as violation of export controls, violations of deemed exports or ITAR that fall within those rule systems. And so maybe it's just because I've spent my life having to live transparently with US government reporting requirements, but I think increasingly that's going to be de rigueur for academic research that involves US government grants and funding. My third and final point today deals with Chinese cyber espionage, and perhaps more recently, the digital disinformation operations that we see coming out of China, particularly during COVID-19. Now, cyber espionage has long been China's preferred mode of conducting espionage. It has numerous advantages. Because of social media, it is now possible to do targeting against all of us at distance because of oversharing that we do on LinkedIn and on Facebook and other things that frankly are a targeter's dream from a human intelligence perspective. The logistics of doing cyber espionage versus having to use human assets and the potential signatures and vulnerabilities that creates, it's much preferable, for instance, in the intelligence game to be able to do plausibly deniable cyber espionage as opposed to using a human asset who could potentially then be caught and perp walked on the steps of the federal courthouse in Los Angeles, much to the embarrassment of the Chinese government. Now, this is still very current. In fact, I would argue that under COVID-19, because of the travel restrictions that are preventing the kind of non-traditional collection and talent program travel that we saw before, that cyber espionage is now more relevant than ever. Recently, the US government called out APT-10, Advanced Persistent Threat Group 10, which had targeted 45 US companies across banking, finance, telecoms, biotech, auto, healthcare, and mining, as well as US government agencies like stealing 100,000 records from the personnel records from the US Navy, the Jet Propulsion Lab, and the NASA Goddard Space Center. And the attribution of this activity was a contractor company in China that was operating at the behest of the Ministry of State Security's Tianjin State Security Bureau in order to carry out these kinds of activities. Now, this activity has become more sophisticated over time. There's a lot of interesting empirical challenges in analyzing this activity, particularly after Xi Jinping's supposed promise in the Rose Garden in 2015 that commercial cyber espionage was going to decline. What instead we saw was a dramatic increase in the quality of Chinese government tradecraft and a dramatic increase in the attribution problems associated with that tradecraft as they move their command and control to US cloud and increase their use of virtual machines and other things in order to obfuscate what they were doing. But just this morning in the New York Times, there are some very interesting articles about China's growing use of digital disinformation operations in the United States. Here, I would draw some important distinctions with the Russians. The Russians, whether we're looking at their activities in Ukraine or the near abroad in Transdniester or the Baltics or in Belarus or even the United States, we see a clear, sophisticated pattern of them pitting left against right, right against left, both ends against the middle, and really seeking to delegitimize political and social institutions inside those countries. Historically, China's more timid efforts at information operations had exclusively fallen into two buckets. One was to refute quite loudly Chinese criticism from abroad. For instance, its activities in Xinjiang, its activities in suppressing the protests in Hong Kong, or to present China in the best possible positive light abroad. But we are increasingly seeing a real edge to Chinese information operations and more of a subversion element. This was certainly true in what we saw in the Taiwan presidential election, where the Chinese military's 311 base, otherwise known as the Voice of the Strait, was conducting operations on Facebook, which is very popular in Taiwan, particularly pro-Han Guoyu sites, and certainly seeking to defame and lower the support for the DPP candidate Tsai Ing-wen, and even doing information operations inside of digital channels that we don't have here in the United States, like the Telnet-based PTT forums, particularly the hashtag Hate Politics forum, in order to push the pro-Han message. We began to see the initial use of so-called deep fake videos, which I think is a harbinger of things that we might see in the 2020 presidential election here in the United States. And then finally, we've seen this very aggressive so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, where dozens of Chinese diplomatic officials have set up accounts on Twitter, which in my view is pretty cowardly, considering that it's a platform that the majority of their own population can't see. So it's clearly directed information operations outside of China. But these are extremely popular on Chinese social media right now, and there is no incentive for the leadership to rein it in. We unfortunately now live under pandemic and in a period of increased tribalism, in my view, where there's a reduced penalty for othering outsiders. Populism and in-group rallying is all the rage. And I can't think of any reason why a Chinese political leader would want to step in front of that train. And I think Xi Jinping, frankly, has a great deal to fear from a Bo Xilai kind of character or a Zhirinovsky kind of character that decides to play to the crowds and push a very anti-foreign, pro-China populist message. And so we're certainly looking for that bubbling up in the Chinese system. So let me conclude by talking about some of the effects I think that COVID-19 in particular is having upon the phenomena that I've described and where we might be going from here as we continue to try and flatten the curve and recover, but still confronting perhaps a world that will never be the same post-COVID-19. I would say that the business community, and Bill Overholt is keenly aware of this, had been the last sustained pillar supporting strategic Sino-US cooperation and collaboration. But in the last 5 or 6 years, we certainly saw that pillar begin to get shaky and break as it became increasingly difficult for some companies to make money in China, as IP theft and economic espionage became more rampant. And so it was already shaky before the trade war. The trade war certainly made that shakier. We also saw Xi Jinping and the Chinese system regressing to greater focus on central planning, greater privilege being given to state-owned enterprises, greater focus on state-directed R&D. And frankly, the playing field was becoming less and less level, even though 30 years after reform and opening, many of us had believed that the playing field would become more level. And for me, one of my metrics of this is the fleeing American expatriates from China, who I thought would never leave, but have begun leaving because of their perception that the system was never going to give them a fair shake, and the pollution and all of the other things that had made life there less than hospitable. And the trade war was already breaking the WTO and the multilateral trade system. COVID-19, in my view, was only accelerating those trends. I believe that we're going to come out of COVID-19 with a permanently changed global economy. Many of the multinational companies that I talked to that had feared that they needed to diversify their global supply chains because of the trade war are now using global pandemic as a non-trade war related rationale for diversifying those global supply chains. I think the era of extreme clustering of industrial clusters inside of China will be over. But China's strategic plans have not changed. The Go Out strategy has not changed. BRI, One Belt, One Road has not changed. And Xi Jinping's aspirations for the Chinese dream have not changed. And therefore, I think this puts even more pressure on using economic espionage and recruiting talent from abroad as potentially some of the multinational enterprises that had been the target of domestic technology transfer seek to do that production and innovation elsewhere. Going forward also, I think we should not expect to see some changes in some major thrusts in U.S. policy, in particular executive orders that seek to impose sanctions on state-owned enterprise executives who benefit from cyber espionage. There was an executive order to that effect under the Obama administration. I wouldn't be surprised to see it again in the current administration. Obviously, we've already reformed the law on the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States with the so-called FIRMA, which made it less voluntary, which gave the U.S. government the opportunity to initiate investigations of Chinese merger and acquisition and investment activity. I would expect greater strengthening of the Foreign Agent Registration Act and less leniency about people acting as agents of the Chinese government who have not registered under FARA. And for many of the universities that I talked to, I would expect deemed export reform. In other words, deemed export is when, for instance, an individual at a lab that a U.S. company might run in China, if they had a PRC national working on an instrument in that lab in China that would have required an export license to sell that piece of instrument to a Chinese company or institute, they have to get a deemed export license for that. I wouldn't be surprised in the near term for a foreign national using that instrument at a lab in a U.S. university, that U.S. university would also be required to get a deemed export license. I would expect greater scrutiny of the student visa system under SEVIS. And I would even expect that we're going to see major changes in Hong Kong's customs status, which had been a separate customs zone post-reversion as a way of protecting Hong Kong's economic and political rights, but has instead become the major transshipment point for illicit tech transfer to China because of the difference in those customs regulations. I would expect to see in the near future that those special Hong Kong exemptions would be repealed, and Hong Kong would increasingly be treated as part of a PRC customs zone. And none of those trends, I think, would be decelerated or changed because of COVID. So let me stop right there, Bill, and I'm happy to take any of the questions that may have popped up in the chat that you could help me moderate.
Let me lead off with one question. So all these bad things are happening and we're trying to prevent that. There were a lot of good things happening too. scholarly conferences. When I was at Harvard's Ash Center, before the Xi Jinping era, we always had 3 vice ministers from China who would typically spend a semester, and they got to understand how the U.S. worked. It facilitated my research a lot to be able to walk across the hall and say, you know, what's this China 2030 all about? And an awful lot of that has been shut down. Actually, the guy who wrote 4 books within China promoting the idea of 1,000 talents was a colleague there for a year. And he was very idealistic. So what we've found is the bad things that weren't being addressed are being addressed. But on both sides, the good exchanges, which I think are very necessary for both our countries to understand each other, are being shut down too. There are no vice ministers coming to spend a year anymore. That's a Xi Jinping decision. So do you see a way that we can encourage and restore some of the good exchanges while we deal with the bad things that everybody, at least in America, acknowledges are happening?
Well, I mean, I can only be fair and say that for the first 10 years of my career at RAND, that a great deal of my professional activity involved participating in precisely the kind of venues and fora that you're talking about, Bill. Whether it was track 2s, pure academic, although there really no such thing as track 2s with China, right? And particularly when you're dealing with organizations like Kicker and others, but track 1.5s, because most of my research over the years has focused on areas that are pretty sensitive: cyber, nuclear, intellectual property theft, things along those lines, space. And the Chinese always prefer to have so-called track 1.5 dialogues where non-governmental institutions are technically the host, and then we can each invite government officials from both sides who can make non-statements, issue non-papers, signal each other, socialize with each other. And I have certainly seen the value of that over the years. All I can say is that there's probably going to be greater scrutiny of who specifically those individuals are as we learn more and more about influence organizations and the actual provenance and origins of individuals that might not have been scrutinized in the past may achieve more scrutiny. But God knows there were plenty of times when I would have to contact people in the US government and try and put people on must-fly lists so that they could get through the visa process to be able to come to various conferences. So certainly the answer is not to completely close all of our sphincters and not have those levels of dialogue. I mean, we even had those levels of dialogue during the worst periods of the Cold War, and they certainly have their purpose. So the pendulum may have swung overcorrected the wrong way. That being said, as someone who has been PNG'd from China since the publication of Chinese Industrial Espionage, I would tell current and future scholars that we live in a boon age in terms of being able to still conduct research that doesn't involve interviewing, that our access, while being increasingly restricted to vast amounts of materials available online. I certainly insisted when I was at the one time in my career that I've been to Fairbank last year, I insisted on being taken down into the vaunted library so that I could get access, so I could see some of those materials. So China is very unique in the extent to which particularly on issues that I research on military and other things, to have such a vast publishing enterprise. So it's not like we're reverting, in my view, back to the era where all we had was People's Daily and Beijing Review and a couple of other propaganda rags to be able to try and divine what was going on in China. But, you know, I would also make the argument that it's the absence of our track one dialogues under the previous security dialogues we used to have with the Chinese, that those were absolutely essential, that the Obama administration ran. You can have those dialogues even when you strongly disagree with people. You know, I embrace the dialectic, and I think that we should embrace the dialectic. You know, if we can't defend our positions and policies with our Chinese counterparts, then maybe they're not worth defending. And so I just think that there's been an unfortunate retrenchment and a lot of the ill will on both sides related to expelling of reporters, which I abhor on the Chinese side, because I think that having US journalists in China is as good for China as it is for the United States. And so, you know, I do believe that, you know, post-COVID-19, we're going to have to restore some of these mechanisms. But if you saw the Pew polling yesterday, there has been a major shift in American attitudes about China because of the progression of this pandemic. And it's going to take a long time for the relationship to heal from this.
Thank you.
Okay.
Others?
Yeah, I'll jump in with some questions here that have come in the chat. As I said before, there's lots of questions. We won't get to them all, but thank you all for asking and continue sending them in. So Minya from Boston University says, I see US policy as having an impact on collaboration. How do you see the prospect of China's innovation future? Can China develop its own innovation system?
I don't believe that China can sustain an autarkic innovation system. It needs to be connected to the global intercourse on science and technology. And as I said before, the current investigations are not focused necessarily on overt scientific cooperation, but it's been on the sort of underhanded shenanigans associated with IP theft and economic espionage, and this so-called non-traditional collection. But by the same token, let me say that I think that we're focusing a little too much on China in this respect. I'm equally worried about the lack of dedicated US funding for R&D and for STEM research in the United States. I'm very concerned about our own innovation engine. And, you know, when people say to me, well, you know, how is it that such huge percentages of grad students at US hard sciences programs are from abroad? And why are US universities becoming so financially addicted to full freight tuition from foreign students? My first question is, well, what are we doing to foster STEM education in the United States so that those hard sciences programs aren't so completely dependent on foreign graduate students? And so I think we have a lot, you know, and I'll even say something completely heretical, Bill. I don't believe industrial planning is a dirty phrase. You know, and I believe that the administration's 5G proposal, for instance, was unfairly caricatured as some sort of socialist Gosplan initiative. We should have industrial planning in the United States, and we have a long storied history of industrial planning. NASA was industrial planning. DARPA is industrial planning. The internet was industrial planning. The Eisenhower interstate system was industrial planning. And so there's a difference between having government-run economics versus building the infrastructure necessary to allow the free market to flourish. And so I know I've spent the vast majority of my time talking about some of the negative things going on the Chinese side, but I'm just as big a cheerleader for getting our own house in order.
Okay, this question is from an anonymous viewer. They say, what efforts are ongoing in the government and academia to address threats posed by the non-traditional threat that is below the threshold of the 1831 statutes you spoke about?
Well, so, I mean, again, being Irish, I know from 12-step programs that the first step is knowing that you have a problem. So educating universities and research organizations about the nature of these programs, tightening up disclosure requirements. Now, I will admit that some of this has been somewhat ham-handed, we need to perhaps smooth some of the ways in which this has been presented to organizations that are not used to dealing with federal law enforcement or the U.S. national security and intelligence apparatus. Guilty is charged. I hope that my presentation today is part of presenting a more balanced view of this and a more contextualized view of what we think wrong is going on versus what is not wrong. But at the end of the day, we needed to get the information out about the nature of these collection operations and provide real resources to universities to be able to do their own risk assessment. And so I'm involved with efforts with the US government in order to begin putting out more unclassified open materials that correctly characterize the difference between, for instance, a state key lab or a national defense key lab in China as a collaboration partner, or what I call a defense industrial university in China, like Harbin Engineering, or one of these organizations that's actually more wedded to the Chinese defense industrial base than it could be called an independent academic institution, and organizations or numbered defense industrial conglomerate institutes and things along those lines, and organizations that are legitimate and overt opportunities for research collaboration with Chinese organizations. That kind of information, we're trying to push more of that out. Our Australian friends at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and their China Defense Universities tracker that is online is a good resource, and we're going to try and put out US-based resources that are fully footnoted, fully sourced, completely unclassified, that will allow organizations to do their own risk assessments.
Okay. Victor Schur asks, has China offered to trade, quote unquote, arrested scientists with the US government?
Victor, I'm not aware of any kind of trades like that. I would say that, again, the distinction between arrested scientists who are guilty of criminal activity involving economic espionage or IP theft, who are not considered agents of intelligence services. Again, I realize there's a lot of gray there, but it's an important distinction, versus someone like Xu Yanjun, who's an actual MSS case officer from the Jiangsu State Security Bureau, who had been running an asset in General Electric in order to steal advanced turbine engine technology, which has long been an industrial priority for the Chinese side to make up for a major gap in their innovation engine, who was lured to Belgium, arrested by the Belgian domestic service, and then extradited to the United States. Now, that is a rare case in which we are going to be prosecuting someone from the Ministry of State Security. That might be apples to apples in terms of trades.
Okay. Noriyuki Shikata says, as decoupling between the US and China accelerates, could the US choose to use free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in collaboration with such countries as Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, to establish common technology and economic standards across the Indo-Pacific region, including the option of the US returning to TPP, CPTPP? Would that have positive influence for encouraging China's further reform and opening up?
Yes, that's an excellent question. I think that first and foremost, we have tried to unify and synchronize our standards over the last 10 years on intellectual property theft and non-traditional collection within what's, the first circle, the Five Eyes relationship with the Australians and the UK and New Zealand and Canada, because we can also then share more easily classified information with them. But I will say, and it's not just my own self-aggrandizement, the vast majority of the information in this space comes from publicly available information. The vast majority, which makes it easier to share with partners outside of the Five Eyes, including treaty partners like the Japanese, the Philippines, the Republic of South Korea, and others. And so, creating an environment in which we have a common understanding of the threat, we have a common database of the institutions that are carrying out this non-traditional collection, that's clearly the first step. Synchronizing our export control regulations is important. Synchronizing our activities under the Wassenaar arrangement for dual use technologies that are not export controlled, but nonetheless, we believe could contribute to strategic technology developments that might be militarily threatening. All of these are opportunities under the open Indo-Pacific strategy that we have in the region. I, for one, am a big fan of TPP and believe that it should be reinvigorated because it really is a common community of standards. And it also gives, like WTO did, gives the Chinese economy a standard to shoot for in terms of improvements in reducing state subsidies, improving intellectual property legal protections, and other things as a standard for entry. And so, because I do believe fundamentally that the greatest lever that the United States has for altering this predatory and strategic behavior by the Chinese government and its economy is in fact access to the US domestic market and investment in the US market and access to US technologies in the US market. That is our greatest source of leverage. And we need to craft policies that allow us to use that leverage in order to create a fairer, more level playing field for our companies to operate in China.
Ezra, yeah.
I think we are all indebted to you for this very thoughtful, detailed analysis. The question we have, I think, in universities is that there are a lot of good reasons for cooperation, a lot of good reasons for study that are open. And how do you draw the line between what is good research that should be encouraged, mutual learning, if we were working on something that would get reduce the problems of the virus now, and we came up with some joint results that are obviously good for everybody. So how do you draw the line as national policy for what we should be doing to encourage global research and where it becomes a national problem, where it's stealing and is a real issue?
Well, I mean, I think the most obvious candidates, Ezra, are areas in which our mutual research is mutually beneficial. And, number one on the list is climate change. Number two on the list is global biohealth. We have, if anything, the last 5 to 10 years has cast into stark relief the importance of both of those. Now, that's not to say that within those, like for instance, in global biohealth, there are certainly things where there are national security implications, where things can be weaponized. But we have mechanisms under the Biological Warfare Convention, which the US and China are both signatories to, for dealing with that. And frankly, I think that collaboration should also focus on raising certain standards. I think that one of the dilemmas we have with China on on global public health rate in the last decade has been the extent to which the difference in the Chinese regulations and rules and norms have meant that they become the place of choice for various types of genomic research and human subject testing that frankly doesn't meet our ethical and regulatory standards. I'm particularly concerned about Chinese research involving things like CRISPR. But we can't alter that by cutting ourselves off from it, but instead there has to be an incentive-based system where the Chinese side sees the value in collaborating with us, and in exchange has to meet certain regulatory and ethical thresholds that we're comfortable with. And that's one of the values, as you know from your many exchanges. One of the many things that come out of that are greater understanding of each other's systems, as well as greater socialization about those kinds of standards. And that certainly won't happen if we're doing that research in isolation from one another.
Okay, looks like we have time for at least one more, maybe two questions, we'll see. So Stephen Schinkel asks, you discussed some differences between China and Russia in cyber with information ops. Do you see any cooperation between them? If so, in what areas, e.g. targeting the US/the EU? I know Russia is concerned with Chinese technology theft as well.
They are. I mean, I'm a historic skeptic of Chinese and Russian strategic entente, if only because having spent enough time with each side talking about the other, there are some deep-seated, there's deep-seated distrust. There's some pretty ugly racial flavoring of that distrust between the two sides. And there are plenty of cases in which the true strategic interests of those countries prevented them from collaborating. A perfect example is I was assured at high volume by the infamous Sheng Guangcai years ago that Russia would never abandon them in terms of strategic arms control and would never abrogate the ABM treaty, which would allow us to develop a national missile defense system. In fact, the Russians did abrogate the ABM treaty. Why? Because their arsenal was significantly larger than China's and in a parity with ours, that they had nothing to fear from national missile defense. And so they were perfectly happy to ignore China's strategic interests in favor of their own in that case. And I could cite other examples. I'm more concerned about strategic emulation of each side. I know from reading Chinese military sources that they are keen students, for instance, of Russian gray zone hybrid warfare, and which they believe has identified a unique Achilles heel of the American way of war that allowed the Russians to achieve territorial control over Crimea. And so I can imagine as they have similar situations, you can imagine from little green men in the Russian case to little white and blue boats in the Chinese case. In other words, the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia, and how they could use those kinds of irregular forces in places like the South China Sea and the East China Sea in order to attain territorial control over things like Scarborough Shoal and Second Thomas Shoal, while using plausibly deniable cyber attacks like the Russians did against weak critical infrastructures like that in the Philippines. And our only response as the United States would be gray hull armed US Navy ships, which of course would look escalatory compared with unarmed or lightly armed Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia. And there is a real strong sense, I think, of Chinese military learning from those kinds of dynamics in the Russian near abroad, and how they could be applied to Asia. Now, that's not to say that there isn't specific intelligence sharing and cooperation between the two sides, but certainly I'm either not aware of it or just wouldn't be able to comment on it.
Okay, I'd say we have time for one more question here. So this one is from an anonymous viewer. Germany suffered similar IP theft after World War II, however, done by the US for America's rise. For example, the Operation Paperclip, in which more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, such as Werner von Braun and his V2 rocket team, were taken from Germany to the United States for the US government employment. Do you consider this type of IP theft unavoidable when a country is rising, or is there something Germany or the US could have done differently?
I disagree with the historical analogy. I mean, if you want to be critical, if you want to accuse the United States of hypocrisy, the much easier case is the theft in the 1800s of cotton gin technology from English textile mills, which were brought to the United States and then formed the basis of the American textile industry that then became a major competitor to English textiles. Okay, so that's fair. Frankly, at the end of World War II, there was no coherent German political or legal system that would have contested the status of those scientists, and we were also trying to get them more quickly than the Soviets could grab them, and the Soviets grabbed their share of German nuclear and missile scientists for the Cold War. So, I prefer the English textile analogy. Maybe the best reverse analog of what you're talking about are the mistakes that the United States made in a McCarthyist way at the beginning of the Cold War with people like Chen Shih-sun, who, for all intents and purposes, was a loyal and happy employee of Caltech and JPL, and could have made significant contributions to the U.S. Missile program, and instead was forced in the McCarthyist era to be deported to China, where he then helped the Chinese build their own missile program and contributed to their own strategic technology programs. And that really is really one of the more regrettable and shameful episodes in U.S. history, and certainly a cautionary tale about what we should avoid in terms of the treatment of loyal and beneficial Chinese Americans in the United States who are working within our national security and defense industrial base, and should certainly not have their loyalties unfairly questioned without evidence. Seems like a good place to end it, don't you, Nick?
Thanks so much, James.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think that we can call it there. That's our 1:45 time. We had lots of great questions. Again, sorry for everybody we didn't get to the questions. We were really just kind of pulling them in. Great speaker. Sorry, Ezra, did you say something?
I just want to thank the speaker again for spending the time and giving us such an informative presentation.
No, well, thank you, Ezra and Bill, for the invitation, and I look forward to seeing you guys in some of my favorite Patriot bars in Southie when all this recent unpleasantness is over.
I guess on that note, we will conclude. Thank you all. And a recording of this will be made available on our website and across our social media channels. Thank you again.